If you think about, your example of, let's say, a native-born American getting into Chinese culture, when he or she is practicing, calligraphy or learning Chinese, he's not becoming more Chinese, right? It just made me not think about culture in this way that is very bound up with identity.
Hi everyone, welcome to an episode of Chinatown 2.0. I'm your host Richard Yan. Today, I'm very excited to be interviewing my friend Wang Sixiang. He is a professor in East Asian Culture and Language Studies at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. And he previously completed his studies at Columbia Bachelor's and Columbia's PhD program. And then he did his postdoc at University of Pennsylvania and later a fellowship at Stanford University, all in the East Asian Culture and Language Studies department. So Sixiang is one of the most fascinating people I know. He is extremely knowledgeable about China, Chinese history, Chinese language, and he dresses the part, as you will see in my interview with him later on. And today we talked a range of topics, including the political climate in America, the presidential administration, the China-US relationship, the fact that University of California is doing away with the SAT system in its admissions process, and so on. But the part I felt that I had the most takeaway from was the discussion around his childhood, how he came to reconcile his identity, how he decided to embark upon this particular career path while deciding that he was an American. So this was a fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy it. And if you like the show, please do not forget to like this episode and hit the subscribe button and also hit the bell for notification for new videos. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the show. Let's dive right in. Hi, Sixiang. Welcome to the show, Chinatown 2.0. How are you doing?
Not bad. Thank you for having me.
Not at all, not at all. So, Sixiang, why don't you give us the Sixiang 101, if you will, but maybe with some focus on your current career.
Sure. So I'm currently assistant professor at the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures here at UCLA. Well, I shouldn't say here because I don't know where you guys are, but I'm here in Los Angeles.
Right.
I work for the University of California, Los Angeles. And our department focuses on all sorts of languages and cultural content related to Asia, and Asia is broadly defined to include Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, East Asia, China, of course, is a big part of it. My area of specialization is actually in Korean history. My courses primarily concern the history of Korea before the modern period. So that's my area of specialization and also my main research area. And right now I'm writing a book about the history of Korean diplomacy with Imperial China, looking more or less from the 15th century to the 17th century. So that's what I do right now. And a little bit more about myself, I guess. Should I? Yeah,
go ahead, please.
I was born in
Give us
Hefei.
the full picture.
Yeah, I was born in Hefei in Anhui, China in 1984, and I came with my parents in 1987 to the United States. So I spent most of my childhood in the United States. I grew up in New York City in Washington Heights. In the 80s, it was known as the crack cocaine entrepot of the American East Coast. It was not a very safe neighborhood, but what started to happen was various groups of immigrants started coming into this neighborhood. My parents were among a very small group of Chinese immigrants. There weren't very many. So the area started becoming more and more Spanish speaking and Washington Heights, if you know, is the home to the largest Dominican population outside of the Dominican Republic. And so that's where I grew up. And I stayed in New York through most of my childhood and my young adulthood. I attended Columbia University as an undergraduate, and I went on to do my degree in East Asian Languages and Cultures, also at Columbia University. And after I finished my degree, I started, wandering around the world. Well, not really so much around the world, but hopping from various institutions to another until I ended up here in Los Angeles.
So tell us, maybe take us through the journey of how you arrived at this particular career path of yours, how you made that decision. Were there any were there any other options that you were also looking at, right? Any kind of influence externally from, say, a parent or a peer? And I mean, in particular, right? I mean, I know tons of Americans that are very interested in Chinese culture and Chinese language. And in fact, it is a very fascinating subject. I don't know a lot of Chinese people in America that grew up in America that does this though, right? Maybe I'm just not in that circle, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about the collective conscious of this particular group, starting with you as an individual.
We are. I think it's very tricky. I mean, if you talk about me, in terms of my professional life, I mean, what's funny is, as you know, my field of expertise is not China, it's Korea, right?
That's true.
Right. So I'll.
But you already demonstrated insurmountable amount of knowledge of Chinese, though. I have not started with the Korean.
But it's connected, and I'll tell you why. I think I mean, I think that I have to make a long story short because I can go on and on.
Of course.
But I think one really difficult thing about growing up as Chinese American in the United States in the 80s and 90s, especially in a neighborhood that is not Chinese, is just you're not comfortable. You're always wondering, who am I? What am I? And what's also funny is, it's not really a dichotomy of American versus Chinese. I grew up in an immigrant community. I mean, there were very few American-born children even in my school. Most people were. Many of them were from the Dominican Republic, and Spanish was the main language that everyone spoke. But I mean, I stood out. I was El Chino for everyone. I was maybe one of 2 or 3.
You said Chino?
Chino, yeah. I mean, that was who I was. I didn't really have a name. But it was a while, and I think I remember when I was very young. I told my mom, I don't want to be Chinese. I want to be American. And of course, I didn't know what American.
Did you really say that?
Yeah, I did. Wow. And my mom told me, you just have to be. You are Chinese. There's nothing you can change about that, and that is what it is. But I mean, this was maybe when I was 7 or 8. But I think later, when I started learning Chinese. I actually spent a lot of time doing this when I was a teenager, and part of it was possible because my grandmother, who was a school teacher before she retired in China, came to visit us for a year. And during that time, she spent a lot of time helping me achieve functional literacy, and we did it through reading and comic books and learning Chinese and things like that. So that helped me with my literacy, and I think that got me enough to delve into Chinese culture and history on my own terms, where I can explore on my own. So I was reading things like 三国演义 and 水浒传 and 东周列国志 and things like that on my own, as a teenager. And then I started doing calligraphy, and I really got invested in this idea of being Chinese. But of course, I was in the United States. I was growing up American, culturally in so many ways. And then I went back to China when I was 16. So between 3 and 16, I was in China once when I was 9 for maybe a month, right? But I think when you're 9, you're not, it's.
And wait a second. 所以你在16岁之前就已经读了你刚刚说那些书，《三国演义》、《红楼梦》，不是《红楼梦》，《水浒传》什么《东周列国》之类的。
Yeah, in various editions, right? So 三国演义 I read actually the 原文, right? And I was also watching TV with it, right?
所以读了文言文是吧？就是原文。
其实三国演义是白话文, right? 它是
对， you're right.
So yeah, but the point is, I was doing this on my own, and then I went to China when I was 16, and I really thought, I'm really going to make myself really Chinese. But I think what happened was when I went to China, I realized I wasn't Chinese, because it was not, this was a diaspora experience, right? Where reading these things, doing these things doesn't make you, modern Chinese person culturally. I mean, there's, your popular culture, your value systems can be different. It's just not the same, right? And I think I had this identity crisis. It's like, and I think in Chinese we often talk about 中外, right? Are you Chinese or are you foreign? Are you like 中美? It's a very sort of black and white, or maybe yellow and white. I don't know. The very dichotomous, right?
Sure.
And then, and this is where Korea comes in. And I think when I was 18 or 17, in my high school was a very good high school. It was a private high school. It's the Horace Mann School in Riverdale in Bronx in New York, right? And it's you can Google the school. Our Attorney General went there.
William Barr?
Yeah, William Barr. Right now, there's a campaign in our high school to remove him from like the honorable trustees list because he violates the Constitution. But anyway, but that's our school. You can read about it. Lots of scandals. But anyway, that was the school I went to. But what was nice was we had a really open elective curriculum, and we actually had East Asian history as a course.
Okay.
Right? Taught by.
That's sort of unusual for the times.
Yeah, extremely unusual. The reason we had it was our, I guess the equivalent of our assistant principal. I mean, we had a different word for this, but basically in normal school, we call it assistant principal. His name was Dr. Larry Weiss, and he graduated from Columbia University back in the day, and he learned Chinese, and he wrote his dissertation on the Korean War, China's involvement in the Korean War. And he was
this is a white guy?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think, by heritage, he's Jewish, Larry Weiss.
Okay.
But he spoke Chinese, and he in addition to his administrative duties, he would teach this Asian history class. And then we actually one of our textbooks was actually a really old textbook about Korean history. And I read the book, and I think it was really eye-opening for me as a Chinese American kid who was struggling between this very black and white way of thinking about the world, or very sort of 中外, China or foreign way of reading the world. Because if you know some basic Korean history, which I didn't at the time, is for 2,000 plus years, the Korean Peninsula used Chinese characters. Their elites wrote in what we would call Wenyanwen, right? And they were they're perfectly fluent in this writing system, and they had to deal with this question of
they also had their own identity crisis. Is what you're saying?
So everything I just told you about how Wenyanwen works, I think made me break the East-West 中外 dichotomy. It's no longer.
How so? How does Wenyanwen help you break that?
Well, because Wenyanwen, if you think about 中外, right? I mean, Korea for China is 外国. Right, but but historically they've been using classical Chinese in everything they're doing, right? So what this means is the cultural assets that we think of as Chinese are not things that inherently are bound up with identity in the way that conventionally Chinese people may think, right? Because these are things that can travel very far. If you think about your example of, let's say, a native-born American getting into Chinese culture. When he or she is practicing, calligraphy or learning Chinese, he's not becoming more Chinese, right? It just made me not think about culture in this way that is very bound up with identity. So I think it made me more free, and I just sort of felt that, I don't have to, devoting myself to learning about China and, my identity as being Chinese, identity as being American, these are things that are all negotiable, right? And these boxes don't really,
it's not like you have to be in one of these boxes.
Exactly. And I think learning about Korean history made me sort of realize this. I mean, I think it's not a very clear one-to-one relationship. But I think it also made me sort of, when I went to college and I started learning Korean language and then getting into, Korean history more seriously. I mean, I think it also helped me think beyond, China versus the West, right? Because there's more to the world than that, right?
Right, of course.
Right, and I think once you see this world in a more three-dimensional way, you're no longer stuck in this sort of either-or mentality. I think that
I see. So let me see if I get this right. So basically, growing up, you were very interested in Chinese culture. You were in a Chinese household, but that makes you different, right? Because you can't talk to your friends or your classmates about these interests, and maybe there are certain stereotypes and uneasy conversations you would have them if you further reveal yourself to be interested in those things. But having read the Korean history, you sort of get a sense that you can still be interested in those things while maintaining your identity as an American. That's completely okay. Right? Is that what it is? So you basically became more comfortable with the fact that you were so obsessed with this kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah. And I think also feeling more comfortable with being Chinese as well, because, I mean, one thing that's interesting about Korea is that, many of the traditional value systems, especially before the 19th century, overlap a lot with Chinese traditional values. Confucianism, Buddhism, I mean, we can go on. But participating in these things doesn't make them more Chinese. It's just, it's a these things are fluid, right? So I think one of the bigger problems I had with growing up with Chinese is like, well, if I'm really interested in Chinese culture, but I don't identify with certain aspects of, modern China or certain aspects of, certain value systems. One thing I always did was fight with my father about whether or not I should be allowed to talk back to him.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. He would
That's
say,
sort of circular, isn't it?
yeah, for him, it's just
Yeah.
like, a good Chinese child should never speak back to his parents. And then, of course, I grew up in America. I mean, this is getting into stereotypes a bit, but I'm like,
Yeah,
teenage rebellion is the right of the American child, right? We
yeah.
have,
Do you think that's true though, actually, these days?
probably not, but in the 90s,
Yeah.
it was.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I think these are all constructs, right? These are not, these are stereotypes. These are ideas that people throw out. I mean, Chinese children talk back to their parents even in the Song Dynasty, I think. But but the idea is that. But I think for me, it's just realizing that you don't need to. You can pick and choose what you need, and what you want, and what works for you. And I think that's what learning Korean history helped me with. I mean, psychologically. And if you look at Korean history, there's a lot of engagement with what we would think of as Chinese culture, but for them it's pick and choose, right? There's no idea that they should take everything and just but there's always a selective process. And I think for me it's also and a selective process also with the United States, with American culture and Chinese culture. I don't have to be one or the other. It's more about and I think this is true not just for me, but for everyone, right, who's bicultural or multicultural. You're straddling different societies, and people will see you differently depending on who you are. And I think and in the end, we all are choosing. We all have to choose, right? But I think it's just when I was younger, I didn't know that I could choose.
Of course, right. Wow, it's fascinating. I mean, so I know you're basically positioning yourself sort of as a global citizen in a way, right? And then you happen to be interested in this particular subject matter, just like someone could be interested in the language of mathematics or the language of C++, right? But this happens to be your language, and you can sort of decouple that from your identity, right? And you can pursue excellence in diving into the history. You can make a living from teaching about this stuff.
I mean, I don't know if I'm positioning myself as a global citizen per se, because I think what that seems to imply is that I can stand completely outside of my context, right? As American, I'm not American-born Chinese, but bicultural Chinese American, and I can.
Right.
I mean, I can adopt the vantage point of that global citizen to cope with some of the anxieties and troubles and whatnot. And I think it helps when things, for example, right now, relations between China and the US is horrible. It's probably going to get worse. And I think it's just that people's moods are different, right? I mean, I think you see this, if you go through WeChat, if you go through Twitter, I mean, I think what's really uncomfortable, and I think, over the past 30 years, is that there have been difficult moments between US and China, but very few, and the officials say all these horrible things, but you don't get a sense that the people, like the general population, has soured on each other, right? I mean, in China, it's like, okay, yes, there's conflicts with the US government, but, there's sort of it isn't like this now. I think the mood both in China and the US among its own citizens has changed. And I think the political theater is contributing to that. And I think it's very depressing to think of it. But, if I take the position of a global citizen, I can sort of, look at it more objectively, and I can cope with it, right? But I can't, because I'm emotionally invested in the outcome. Right. Like, I don't want to go back. And I mean, I think it would be very difficult for someone to be truly, both, I mean, on a material level, we're all affected but I think on an emotional level, I don't qualify, because everything that happens between the US and China is deeply painful. I think it's just, well, not everything. Sometimes things are good and it's not painful, but often it's, and if you bring in morals and values into it, I mean, there is no clear-cut picture on either side. I mean, I have strong sympathies, in very many directions, and I also have very strong opinions about the politics happening in the US and China. And, I can't support either, and I can't not support either, right? And I think, and of course, politics is already complicated. So, it's not, so I think that, this would probably be a whole different conversation, but I just think, on that level, right? I think one's upbringing, one's past, one's emotional connections to different places and different, communities. I mean, you can't really just make it go away.
Yeah, a friend in China was actually, this is someone that I know on Twitter actually, so maybe not my friend, but this person was basically asking, how do I explain to my parents about Trump? How do I explain to them his behavior, his way of thinking, and so on? This is a Chinese person. So I responded in Chinese on Twitter, right? And I'm pretty proud of my characterization, right? See if you think there's merit in it. So I basically said, 我觉得 Trump 有点像一个装修佬，装修佬是广东话，意思就是说一个那个包工头 ，right？ 就是renovation contractor。然后 so 他什么事情都是凭直觉，不怎么读书，非常会 negotiate， 然后非常的 street smart， 然后执行力非常的强，但是什么事情可能都只是觉得自己的直观臆断非常的厉害，然后就kind of just when making decisions sort of just go with that, and he kind of surrounds himself with lots of people, and also the other thing is that 包工头 the power structure is highly centralized. So basically it's kind of like a yi and tang, and he needs a lot more yes men or yes women around him than people that have to send and like cause all these problems. I think that sort of partially explains why that person would not seek ties with universities or do all this research, because in his mind, euphemistically, he's practicing common sense politics, right? It's like you read all these papers and do all these academic studies, and yet things don't turn out well, right? And then there are certain pockets of the American populace that are just neglected for years. Let's rectify that. I think that's where it comes from, and that's why some people really like it, and then some people really despise it.
I think, in describing Trump is that, I think that's how Trump thinks he is, but I don't think that's what Trump is. And I think maybe I think if he's a boggle-toe, he's not a very good one, because I think, I think there are various layers, right? Because there's Trump the person, there's Trump the president, there's Trump the Republican figurehead. Because I think the main reason why I think he's in power still, despite all the mess, is because, as long as there's a Republican president appointing the right, judiciary officials to key posts. And this is where Chinese history is very useful. If you look at all the bad emperors, they're always surrounded by brown nosers and taijian and jianchen and things like that, right?
宦官当政.
Right, but the thing is, the emperor likes them because they listen to him. But why do they want to suck up to the emperor? It's because they can then achieve their own objectives, right? I mean, so many of the jianchen that in Chinese history are actually people who had political vision for something, right? And they thought that by getting the emperor, giving the emperor everything he wants, he can have the political clout and cover to achieve his objectives. So I don't think all of the things that the Trump administration is doing is really Trump's idea, or Trump thinks this is a good idea. But it's just that, the people around him are, for whatever reason, are able to get him to like him, and then they're in power and they're trying to achieve, their objectives. And I think that's something, if you have taken a look at Bolton's book, you get a sense of, right? Bolton flat out says that he thinks Steve Mnuchin is a Democrat. The Treasury Secretary. And I think what it is just that, some people in the Trump administration are there because they believe that they can, they have this vision, or they have, whether this vision is personal, political, ideological, I think it varies. Like, some people are there just to make money. Some people are there because they want to be famous. Some people actually have policy goals.
Well, so you have this very interesting background. You're married to a French woman who speaks Mandarin, and you have, biracial children. Do you want to teach them Chinese? Do you want to consciously teach them the language as opposed to just, speaking to them because you feel comfortable speaking the language from time to time, right? And then, is there any kind of Chinese parenting mentality from you in terms of shaping their future and setting them up for success, the more euphemistically way of saying it? Like, do you want them to play instruments? Do you want them to go to Ivy League school, right? Like, do you want to ace the SATs before, you know, the UC systems and all the rest take them away as criteria for admission?
It would be nice if they did well on their SATs, but I think I would want to devote their time, right? If I have control over their time, which I might not when they're a teenager, to do things that will, you know, inevitably make them better test takers, but not prep them for the test. So if I have a choice between,
that's right,
you know, like 3-week summer camp in France where they're going to, you know, learn about, you know, where they're gonna like, you know, or maybe not France, like to go to a foreign country and learn a new language. Versus like spending 3 weeks doing SAT prep for that language, I would choose the former.
Oh yeah, totally.
Right.
I understand.
Yeah.
I think test taking skills should be the byproduct instead of the the main product.
They probably need some prep just to learn how the test works, but I don't. You know, I think, and I think it's just, you know, I want to.
You know, I see going to university the same thing, or attending an elite university the same thing, right? Being qualified to attend Harvard or attending a, you know, high-ranking university should be a byproduct instead of the sole purpose, right? So there's people optimizing for that, but you end up seeing lots of Asian kids that graduate with golden resumes, but not knowing what they want to do. I met people like that, a lot of people like that.
And I think it's sort of tragic because, you know, one, they often have an inferiority complex because, you know, I went to Harvard, but how come I'm not like the other kids? Two,
what's it called? The pretentious syndrome?
The imposter syndrome.
The imposter syndrome, yeah.
They might feel, you know, there's confidence issues. There's also, you know, a lot of their youth was spent doing things they weren't necessarily invested in. So then they don't have the emotional, cultural, or mental health capital. I mean, there are various ways to describe this. The Constitution to sort of let them, you know, develop more fully. I mean, there are many. Right.
And you know, and one very bad thing is that you have to do well in every subject. And then what happens is that in life, you're supposed to do well in one thing, right? You don't have to be. So the problem is that if I get an A in history, I'm going to stop studying more for, you know, the Civil War just because I'm interested in it, because I got to, you know, do more work in, you know, chemistry or something. So, but that's not how real life works.
Do you think life is about being good at one thing?
Yeah. So let's put it this way. I think you should be as good at many things as possible, to the extent that your capacity would allow it, right? So I think the right approach there is to be good at least one thing, and to pursue. And the problem is that if you want to be really good at something, you have to be very passionate about it, and you have to devote time and energy. And you shouldn't have this mentality of, well, I gotta divert my time and just be use minimal amount of time to get to a certain threshold for this, and then move on to this and that.
Right.
And then the problem is that I think a certain education mentality right now, or back when I was, you know, studying for school, preparing for colleges, is to basically, you know, like this 平均用力的 mentality.
Right. It's a min-maxing. It's gaming the system, right? It's trying to optimize your, you know, people play video games called this min-maxing, where you're just, you know, you want to make sure you spend only the optimal effort, regardless of what's actually fun or useful or, you know, rewarding, right? And I think, yeah, and I think there's a contradiction or tension, right? Because I think as people, as humans, you know, we're actually happy we're jack of all trades. You know, we're a species that enjoys doing many different things, and you know, but I think our economy is one that requires specialization, right? So, and I think we actually desire to be engaged with different things. You know, if you only do one thing for your whole life, I don't know if that is very satisfying for most people. And I think, you know, an education or an upbringing, right, is one that, you know, you want to.
Isn't there a difference between surviving and thriving, though? Right. Like to survive, you have to have a trade, right? Yeah, and then you can talk about, you know, pursuits of various hobbies, like me doing this podcast, for example.
I mean, in a pre-industrial society, it was probably the other way around, right? Like, I mean, if you think about, if you're a farmer or a hunter-gatherer, you actually have to be just good enough at a lot of different things, right? Rather than being specialized. But I think in our sort of, you know, capitalist,
the specialization of labor has certain implications, such as pigeonholing people into certain things. And I think there's a difference between the predominant European thought and the American thought on this too, isn't there? Right. So I just feel that in general, so I'm stereotyping here, but a lot of the European way, so the Europeans consider American way of things as the jungle rule, right? Yeah. So basically it's very competitive, and therefore to thrive in the competition, you got to be really good at one thing, you got to work really hard and so on and so forth. But but if you look at Spain, you got the siesta, you got, like in France, there's much more even distribution of wealth, and then there's
6
stories
weeks
of these.
vacation,
What?
right? Most people
Yeah.
get 6 weeks of vacation in August, right? So,
Right. And there's stories about unemployed 20-something-year-old, students just traveling the world on government payroll, and then as a result, they live a much more rich and rewarding life. Can you? I didn't know that.
I think it's probably less common, but there's like the Fulbright scholarship and stuff. You can.
Yeah. Less common though.
Probably less, yeah. Especially in the Southern European countries, but also in the North now. What is the purpose of life? Is it to make money? I mean, I don't know. It's not. I think that's not the answer. In France, the most popular ice cream store in Paris closes for the summer during high tourist season because they want vacation. They're like, well, we're making ice cream so that we can go on vacation,
right.
Not making ice cream so that we can make more ice cream. But the irony is, actually the standard U.S. liberal arts education actually is more jack of all trades than the European, the German.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because there, you start university with a major. There isn't this sort of like smorgasbord liberal arts, your freshman and sophomore years where you get to like play around and pick a major. You often actually start with a very professionalized training right away in college. But one difference is, for example, I mean, Europe is also very different. France and Germany, for example, are really different in terms of their higher ed. Most German university students don't start right away. They after
you mean they take gap year between high school and university?
Yeah, often 2, 3, 5, 6 years. I mean, it
makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, and I think they're more ready, right? And I think one flaw of the American system, which you can also say is the flaw of the Chinese system, because it's actually similar in that respect. You finish high school, you go to college, and you're confused.
Right.
And then you're 22 and you're done. And and I felt this too. Is like so many of the things that happened in college, I would have been able to make better use of it in my 30s. Like I would have been.
Oh, totally, my friend.
Right.
Yes.
You're giving 18-year-olds, you're telling them, you're learning these things that they're not ready to.
Correct.
More interested.
And it's not like these are things you have to learn in your 20s or you forget, right? It's not like a musical instrument where if you start early, you have such a huge advantage, right? And I guess if it's something you're truly passionate about, like with access to web courses and so on, you don't need to actually be physically on campus, right? You could do that in your spare time. You could do that after, your work.
Right.
And, this whole COVID is actually exposing university for what it is, a luxury brand. So anyway, hey, it's been great talking to you, man. Unfortunately, I actually have to jump.
Yeah, sure.
So
we can come back to some of the other issues and questions.
No, we have to.
We never talked about
it's mandatory.
Bicultural language and things like that.
Yeah. So, okay, Sixiang, well, it's been good talking to you. Thanks for coming on the show, and hope to have you back on Chinatown 2.0 soon.
Sure, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, thank you. Take care.
Okay, bye.